All right. Welcome again, everyone. I'm delighted to share that this is the first of our four-part series to examine the intertwined issues of structural inequality and climate justice and energy transition, with a particular focus on South Asia and India's caste system. Today's topic will focus on how the climate crisis is reinforcing the vulnerabilities of oppressed communities and highlight the importance of an anti-caste framework for research and practice. Somewhat similar to questions of racial justice and equity in climate change policies in the US. We have two terrific experts with us today who will make an hour-long presentation followed by a conversation and discussion. We'll also leave some time for questions and answers. We very much welcome your questions, and you can submit those at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. This event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. And finally, today's discussion and this series honors the legacy of Columbia University's illustrious alum, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And it's a happy coincidence that today is the day that India commemorates its rights-based constitution, of which he was the lead architect. So I'm now very pleased to invite Dr. Anupama Rao, the founder of the Ambedkar Initiative at Columbia University and director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, to deliver welcome remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepali, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good evening, and good night. It's lovely to have so many of you with us and to see the kind of interest in thinking about questions of social difference and distinction as they relate to deep structures of inequality, questions of access, and indeed of spatial politics, the relationship between space and the social, which is the topic of this set of seminars on climate justice. So the other convenings in the series will be held on February the 9th, March 1, and then March 22 to mark the historic Mahad Water Satyagraha. And I invite you all to join us for all of these events, which will be online. As Deepali noted, I'm Anupama Rao, Director of ICLS and the convener of the Ambedkar Initiative. And it's a great pleasure to work with Deepali. This series is really her brainchild. She's worked tirelessly to frame a robust series around questions, as I noted, of spatial injustice, of caste labor, and modes of caste-based extraction and expropriation, all in the interest of thinking about the emergent relationship between energy, infrastructure, and inhabitation, undergirded by a broad framework that seeks to think about the ways in which social distinction and difference relate to spatial segregation, with caste being at the bottom of the ways in which we'd like to think about this particular emergent formation. My role really is to offer thanks. So first and foremost to Deepali for putting the series together. Second to Vincent Antwi, who's responsible for the poster, for getting us on Zoom, and more generally for working tirelessly behind the scenes to make this event a smooth happening. I'd also like to thank the Center on Global Energy Policy at SIPA and SIPA's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Climate and Engagement, DEICE Committee, the Columbia Climate School, as well as the South Asia Institute. As we've noted in our description for the series, the humanitarian impact of the climate crisis on vulnerable communities, which have historically contributed the least to climate change, and perhaps the most to forming new modes of life-making, survival, and so forth under conditions of deep precarity, exclusion, and indeed annihilation and extermination, requires a great deal of thought. And we are only now beginning to think about the ways in which castes' long histories of difference, distinction, discrimination, exclusion have all contributed to creating the kind of spatial logics and the spatial politics of the subcontinent. This first session, Environmental Casteism and Climate Disaster, will thus focus on how the climate crisis is reinforcing the vulnerabilities of oppressed communities and begin to outline an emergent anti-caste framework for research and practice. So we'd like to think together with you about the entailments of that emergent research framework, how it might be framed, the kinds of theoretical interventions that might be useful, and indeed how we might begin to think about the new spaces of agrarian relation as well as emergent urbanism that we find ourselves in today. Dipali talked about the significance of today, and indeed the constitutional framework that is produced and which we are trying to hold on to is indeed the legacy of B.R. Ambedkar, and we should be proud. But we began this week on Monday with perhaps one of the deepest or most vivid, spectacular examples of environmental casteism. The destruction of the Babri Masjid in '92 and the ensuing conflict around the building of the Ayodhya temple on its site. And I think we are in some sense poised between or bookended between a moment of foreclosure, if you will, and the new frameworks for opportunity, potential, possibility, and insurgent action that all of us should be thinking together with and around. So thank you so much. And Dipali, please take it away. I'd like to introduce our two speakers in the order in which they're going to offer their comments. Dr. Srilata Sarkar is a lecturer in India and Global Affairs at King's India Institute in London, with research interests in urban political ecology, the politics of caste infrastructure, and the political economy of subaltern urbanization. She's also a contributing writer for Feminism in India and has a deep interest in documentary filmmaking and podcast production in the interest of public outreach. Suprakash Mazumdar is a Pulitzer grantee, a Dalit journalist working on social justice issues in South Asia through the lens of caste, and one of the few Dalit journalists working and writing in India today, it should be noted. They have worked on a range of issues, ranging from climate justice to politics and the ongoing impact of COVID-19. They've been published in the New Humanitarian, Time, Vice, Al Jazeera, Rest of the World, and many, many other publications. It's an honor to have you both with us, and I will turn this over to Dipali Srivastava. Thank you all for joining us again.
Thank you, Anupama, for those excellent welcome remarks and setting the stage for what promises to be a very rich conversation. Srilata, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Many thanks to Anupama for the generous introduction, and many thanks to Dipali for inviting me and for putting this series together. It's really a great honor to be invited to speak in what promises to be a very illuminating series. And I know some of the speakers who are coming later in the series are people whose scholarship and whose work I greatly admire. So I'm very much honored to be invited to be a part of the series. I'm going to start by talking briefly about what kind of researcher I am and what my work is all about and how that connects to the two themes of environment and caste. And I'm broadly going to make 3 points, and I'll try to make them as briefly as possible because I think it's always more exciting to be in conversation rather than to just be speaking at you through a screen. But the 3 points that I'm going to try and broadly make today, or the sort of 3-part argument that I'm going to build, consists of the following. So first, I'm going to try and establish the idea that conversations around environmental governance and environmental policymaking, as well as about environmental justice, which unfortunately is a sort of smaller subpart of that larger conversation about governance and policy, take place in India in a purported caste vacuum, which is not empirically or morally well-founded. And this is not sort of exclusive to the conversation about environment and climate. There is a general tendency, I think, in Indian society by and large, certainly in the sort of dominant mainstream aspects of Indian society, to pretend as if we live in a post-caste world. But like you scratch beneath the surface and it becomes very evident very quickly that we certainly don't. And in fact, the fundamental basis of a lot of societal functioning in India, the material basis of societal functioning in India, as well as economic production and cultural production, is very, very reliant on a very rigid and persistent caste structure that operates through modes of extraction, exclusion, deprivation, etc. So I'm going to try and make the point that the conversations that we have largely in India around issues of environment and climate and policy are devoid of a serious engagement with the question of caste. And then I'm going to move to the second part, which is to sort of lay out why this is and why this is a problem. And I'm going to do that by talking about the idea of property and property ownership and how that is connected to the idea of caste and how the logic of property ownership has been made into the logic through which people are granted rights or are seen as actualized citizens. And so the deprivation of property rights on the basis of caste becomes a mode of disenfranchisement from taking part in conversations and having a say in conversations around policy and justice. And from there, I'm going to move on to the final part of my argument, where I'm going to sort of make the case that we need to reimagine climate justice as caste justice, because it is entirely possible otherwise to arrive at very technocratic so-called solutions to the problems that are thrown to us by the impending climate disaster and the climate crisis overall. But till the time we recognize that these are specific contemporary moments in a very long history of continued deprivation, continued dispossession, continued injustice, we do not actually solve the problem and we do not actually address the core issue of injustice, which is that of caste injustice. And so the forms of climate injustice that we see today are in fact forms of caste injustice, is what I'm going to argue. So I'm going to share my screen very briefly. So the title of my talk today is Reimagining Climate Justice as Caste Justice, which is also the title of a book chapter that I have contributed to an excellent edited volume, even if I say so myself, called Climate Justice in India, which I will talk a bit more about in a little bit. But I'm going to start by showing this image. This is an image from the Godavari, the banks of the Godavari in the city of Nashik, which is one of the places where I have spent some time doing some field work, talking to people. And this is also the site of intense environmental contestations around what sort of interventions should be made into this site, into this space, and into the river setting under the Smart Cities mission, which was one of the flagship urban planning policies of the current regime in India. And it is one of the examples, amongst many others, that illustrate how the particular concerns and the particular forms of environmentalism that are taken seriously by institutions of the state, such as the planning machinery and the judiciary, are very much not only inflected by caste, but are almost determined by the caste position and the caste location of individuals and groups, interest groups who are pursuing those particular environmental concerns. So in this case, for example, there were concerns around concretization of the riverbed. There were concerns around flooding of the river, regular flooding, annual flooding. There were concerns around precarious informal settlements on the banks of the river that were then very vulnerable to the outcome of the flooding. And there were concerns around pollution and such. But the issue that got picked up by the Smart Cities mission, as well as by the local municipality and various other state bodies, was the issue of there being buried kunds below the concretized bed of the river. And these kunds were shown to be, or were claimed to be, of extreme religious importance, because this is also a temple complex and a religious, infrastructural complex around the river. And this was the issue that was pursued by a group of priests from the Brahmin caste, which is the most elite and the most powerful and the most influential caste group. And this was the issue that really gained prominence in the discourse around the smart city infrastructure making and in the consultations around what should be the priority for the smart city. And eventually there was, concrete steps taken towards unearthing or deconcretizing the bed of the river and unearthing these kunds, which are essentially small sort of aqueducts or like conduits that had been there for a long time and had then been concretized and now were, resurrected. And these were deemed to be of religious significance, especially to the Brahmin community, but also to like other sort of devotees who are invested in the religious and ritual significance of the site and of the river. And the fact that this is the issue that took precedence over other issues, such as of pollution of other kinds, or of security of livelihood, security of dwelling for marginalized communities, or even the fact that the labor involved in carrying out this enterprise of deconcretizing, well, first of concretizing and then of deconcretizing, was entirely drawn from marginalized caste groups, is something that one would not find at all reflected in any of the official documentation around the project. And it is something that you only find out when you are a qualitative researcher like me, who goes out there wanting to talk to people. And even then, it is only after extended conversations that people actually start talking about caste, because there is this sort of cultivated conspiracy of silence around caste, especially within urban studies and urban planning and urban policy making, and through that extending into environmental policy making as well. So in my brief-ish career as an urban geographer, I think I have found it quite difficult to remain intellectually honest and not talk about caste when talking about urbanization or urban planning. And this is despite the fact that much of the literature on Southern urbanisms and urban infrastructure and post-colonial urbanism talks very robustly about class, but does not talk as robustly about caste. And this is changing thanks to my colleagues who have done excellent work and continue to do excellent work in the field. But it is still an emerging sort of scholarly tradition, and it's not a well-established one yet. And I found it quite difficult to remain intellectually honest while studying these sorts of issues around infrastructure, planning, displacement, and spatial organization of the city without talking about caste. And then eventually, it also became quite difficult to talk about urban issues without talking about environmental concerns, and especially in the light of the climate crisis and the sort of technocratic and bureaucratic push towards building sustainability talk into all platforms of policymaking without necessarily making that into a substantive discussion or a substantive practice on the ground. And so this is where I suppose I come in with my current work, where I'm trying to bridge the scholarship on Southern urbanisms, on environmental justice and climate justice, and on caste, and bring them all together to sort of posit this argument that there's an urgent need to reimagine climate justice as caste justice. So I'm going to stop sharing for a bit and return to some of the quotes when there in my talk. So let's turn then to this claim that the discussion, the conversation around environmental justice in India takes place, bereft of any sort of references to caste. And this is a problem because when we look at it on the global setting, there is a certain kind of acknowledgement that the history of colonialism and the history of imperialism has a bearing on the climate crisis. And this is sort of institutionalized in the UN acknowledgement of 1992, the adoption of the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So however partial it is, or however incomplete, or however inadequate, there is still an explicit acknowledgement that yes, we are all in this together in this crisis, but not everybody has equal responsibility and not everybody is equally affected. And the extent to which the responsibility can be assigned, or the extent to which the one's vulnerability can be assessed, is very much determined by the history of colonialism and imperialism. And this has sort of been reified recently in the COP28 with the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund. However partial, however inadequate, however contested, that sort of basic level of acknowledgement does exist on the global policy forum about the truth behind the history of the climate crisis. This is something that does not exist in India, in the sense that when we talk about environmental issues at the national level or even the subnational level, there is no explicit acknowledgement that all of these issues come to us in the contemporary times, riding on this very extended history that is steeped in caste-based exclusion, deprivation, etc. And so what I have tried to do in my work, especially in this chapter, is to trace the historical roots of this problem. And one of the things that I've found by looking at the scholarship on agrarian studies and the sort of scholarship on the economic history of colonialism of the British Empire in India, what emerges quite clearly is that we have very, very well evidenced, very well resourced studies from the Punjab province, from the Bengal province, from the Madras presidency, where we see a sort of imposition of a particular property regime and property-based tax regime that forms the basis, the material basis of the colonial state. And what the imposition of this regime is carried out through is this process of systematic displacement and dispossession of what I refer to as caste subaltern groups. Broadly, these are Dalit, Adivasi, Bahujan groups, and the terminology sort of differs, depending on the flavor of the day. That there are different sort of administrative and technical terminology used to refer to different groups under, different regimes from colonial to post-colonial times. And then there are, of course, like self-selected, politically motivated, politically assertive terminology that is used. But broadly, I'm referring to all of these groups as the caste subaltern. And it is very well documented that these were groups who had customary rights and community-based rights to certain forms of land use and certain forms of resource allocation, which was systematically taken away from them during this process of imposition of the property regime and the tax regimes under the colonial state. So while on one hand, there is this kind of dispossession and disenfranchisement that takes place, at the same time, the caste elite, which is the groups who benefit from this process and who enjoy power and privilege and influence within the caste system, they are the ones who not only facilitate the implementation of this regime, but are also made in charge of the process of collecting taxes and facilitating the colonial consolidation of wealth. So they not only facilitate the imposition of the colonial regime, but also benefit from it. And once this system is put in place, it is the right to property or the ability to have land in your name or some form of property in your name that becomes the governing logic for who is seen as a full and legitimate citizen with rights that need to be protected and who is not. And there are multiple examples of this. Unfortunately, the literature in this, again, does not articulate things in terms of caste, because like I said, there is a great reticence, both in society and in academia, to name caste, to call it by its name. But the evidence is very clear that the disenfranchised groups are the caste subaltern, and the ones benefiting from the imposition of these systems are the caste elite. So once these property regimes have been put in place, and the colonial sort of empire comes to an end and we enter post-colonial times, we do not see a drastic reorganization of this regime. We do see an end, for example, to princely states being able to hold on to much of their sort of land and wealth and such. And we do see some degrees of land reforms. But by the time we arrive there, this logic of property ownership as allowing you access to full citizenship is very deeply embedded and institutionalized into the logic of the state. And so those who then remain disenfranchised from property rights, those who were systematically dispossessed and removed from the lands that they first had access to, not only not get access back to those lands, but also remain landless and propertyless. And this is the category of people who then become the itinerant labor force that we currently see in the country today. So we know, especially in the aftermath of the migrant crisis during the COVID lockdown, that much of the labor force in India, which is referred to as the informal labor force, but really it is the labor force that works in agriculture, that works in construction, that works in the informal sector of the economy in terms of providing various services, very crucial, essential services to keep the cities of the country running, are itinerant workers who move from their villages and from various districts into the big cities. And they were made itinerant through this historical process of disenfranchisement and dispossession. And now, once they become this mobile workforce, they continue to remain disenfranchised in the cities that they are themselves building. And I think this became very clear to us during the migrant crisis, during the lockdown, where in a few hours' notice, several hundred millions of people, and we don't even know the exact number because our state doesn't bother to count them, but we know that it is running into over 100 million people at least, who were in the in a matter of a few hours were rendered homeless because they had no security of dwelling, they had no security of food, and they were essentially having to walk back to the villages that they came from, and enduring a lot of challenges in the process, both from the state, also from the people, but of course from the pandemic itself. So I want to now give a few examples of how this logic of property ownership or lack thereof has been institutionalized in the urban planning machinery, and how it continues to govern the ways in which people based on their caste identity either can access the fruits of planning or are deprived from that, and who can have influence and a voice in that mechanism of planning, and those who cannot. So one of the examples that I want to give is of the Pushta Basti, which is an informal settlement on the banks of the Yamuna in Delhi. It's one of the most sort of widely studied informal urban settlements in the urban studies literature on India. And Gautam Bhan has done excellent work on it, as has Asha Gertner, amongst many others. And essentially through this kind of growing scholarly field, what we find is that the Pushta Basti was first settled by workers who were invited to come into Delhi to build the infrastructure for the Asian Games that India was hosting back in the 1980s. And once these workers came and they built the infrastructure, they did not immediately go back, because obviously this is a source of livelihood. And so they settled on the banks of the Yamuna. And then subsequent waves of migrant workers came into the city and the settlement grew. And this is a very sort of common occurrence in most big cities, because of course, if there is a source of livelihood, source of employment available, and most of the informal sector in India is employed in the construction sector, because it is one of the booming sort of most one of the highest recruiting sectors in the Indian economy. So there were more and more waves of workers who came and who settled there. And then the issue of the pollution of the Yamuna starts to gain ground in the urban planning discourse, because this is something that Amitabh Aviskar has termed as bourgeois environmentalism. So there comes about a phase in the urban planning discourse where the environment becomes an aesthetic category, where it becomes all about how does the city look? Does it look green enough? Does it look clean enough? Does it, does it abide by the sort of global standard of what a world-class city should look like? And that is what environmentalism becomes all about. And in the context of that, there are a group of elite residents from elite housing complexes, as well as a group of small factory owners from the area who file public interest litigations claiming that these informal settlements are infectious by their nature and therefore should be removed for environmental hygiene, for hygiene-related concerns. Even though the Delhi Water Board had evidence, it had conducted surveys, and it had collected evidence that showed that actually it is the elite housing complexes and the small industries on the banks of the Yamuna that are the polluting actors, because they are discharging their waste into the Yamuna River without properly treating it, including chemical and toxic waste, and that is the main source of population. But those same group of people file a public interest litigation saying actually it is these tenements and huts and informal settlements that are infectious in nature and therefore must be removed. And the court actually ruled in favor of the litigants and said, yes, they should be removed because by their very existence, they have a polluting character. And I think this is somewhere we see where caste becomes caste logic and caste ideology becomes institutionally ratified without so much as saying the word out. So this idea of people, their bodies, their existence, their presence being inherently polluting is the very essence of caste ideology, which is based on this binary of purity and pollution, which is exercised everywhere from the temple setting to the societal setting to the work setting. So this is something that gets institutionally ratified by the court when it agrees to this idea that certain settlements and certain people, by their very presence, are polluting in nature or infectious in nature. And I want to share now another excerpt to sort of drive home this point a bit more clearly. Right, so this is an excerpt from the chapter that I've been talking about, and this is another example of how the idea of property ownership and the sort of extent to which certain categories of people can be given access to property becomes enshrined in judicial rulings and is driven very clearly by a caste logic, but it's not articulated in those terms. So in 2002, the Ambedkar Slum Utthan Sangathan, ASUS, a coalition of displaced households seeking fair resettlement in Delhi, moved the Delhi High Court against the municipality for assigning them resettlement flats of 24 square meters, as opposed to the 60 square meters that they had originally been promised 30 years prior. The court declined to stop their forced resettlement after a court-appointed commissioner found the flats to be, and a quote here from Gautam Bhan's 2017 article, the court-appointed commissioner found the flats to be commensurate with the status of the persons sought to be shifted. So what the court is clearly saying here is that because these are displaced slum residents who belong to a particular caste, this is not said, articulated in as many words, but because these are people of a certain category, their status is commensurate to a 24 square meter resettlement flat as opposed to a 60 square meter resettlement flat, even if that is what they were promised initially and now are being withheld from. And I want to really focus on the term status here. I mean, today is Republic Day, and we know about the preamble of the Constitution. The preamble of the Constitution actually quite explicitly promises equality of status and opportunity to all citizens of India. And this is a clear violation of that by a judicial organization and by the planning agency, where the logic of caste, which is this idea that people of a particular caste location can be seen to be of lesser status and therefore less deserving of equal property rights or less deserving of a certain promised property than what others might seem to be. So these are some of the sort of not so subtle but sort of indirect ways in which caste logic gets ingrained and institutionalized into mechanisms of planning. And I want to turn now to this one final quote that I have from the city of Shimla. So a little bit of background to this quote here. So Shimla is one of the designated smart cities in the 100 Smart Cities program. And it is also widely known to be very sort of ecologically vulnerable because its status as a hill station. And the particular part of Shimla that was the focus of the redevelopment plan under the Smart Cities mission was the Lower Bazaar area, which is part of the Mall Road and quite a busy sort of market area. And there is this part of Shimla, which often in policy documents historically is referred to as under Lower Bazaar or under Mall Road. And this is basically a settlement called Krishnanagar, which originally was built on soil that was deposited on the mountain slopes in order to make space for the building of the main city, that is the Mall Road, and the sort of government offices. Shimla used to be the summer capital of the colonial state. So the government offices and the sort of recognized planned parts of the city were built after sort of flattening the slope, and the soil that came from flattening that slope was deposited lower down on the slope, and it was on that soil that Krishnanagar was built as a settlement. So it already starts out as a very sort of precarious structure. And this settlement was built in order to provide housing to sanitation workers. So once again, we see the logic of caste very clearly driving the organization of space, where it is assumed that because sanitation workers are drawn largely from the Dalit community, almost exclusively from the Dalit community, it is okay to locate their housing on this very precariously placed part of the city that is much more vulnerable to landslides, much more vulnerable to flooding, and much more sort of precariously placed. And so this happened, several decades ago, and the settlement of Krishnanagar has existed for a long time. And sanitation workers who are formally, officially appointed by the municipality are given housing over here. And now, under the Smart Cities mission, there is a plan to redevelop Lower Bazaar without a very clear plan of what is going to happen to Krishnanagar, because any kind of intervention into Lower Bazaar will automatically lead to some kind of repercussion for Krishnanagar. But there is no sort of, at least at the time of the field work, there was no sort of clear discussion around what that outcome is going to be. And the Smart City mission, purportedly is a very participatory mode of planning where it consults various citizens groups. And I found, and our team from the project Learning from Small Cities found that most of these participatory sort of community meetings were held, again, with property owning residents, with hotel owners, with elite housing and bungalow owners, and with municipality officers, with no representation of the residents of Krishnanagar. And we have here a quote from a union representative of the sanitation workers who says, "Whatever committee has been made, there have been no meetings for us. We are from the Valmiki community, which is at the lowest level. We do cleaning work. There has been no discussion with us on that. After the smart city, where will we live? How will we live?" The house that is given to us from the department, that is 8 by 8, which is 8 feet by 8 feet, the size of the room, only 8 by 8 for a single person. If they have a spouse and the generations grow, keeping that in mind, our people, we are forced to encroach, forced to. So over here, again, we see a systematic deprivation that then leads to quote unquote illegal encroaching, because there is no other way for the people to have legitimate access to property, which is not even property for the sake of profit, but simply property for the sake of dwelling. And he says the entire Valmiki community in Shimla is landless. No one has any land, not even one biswa, which is the local unit for measurement. And so we see here quite clearly that, for this union representative, his caste identity, his lack of property rights, and his deprivation and exclusion from the Smart City mission are all very clearly interconnected. And this is the connection that I have been trying to draw and establish in my scholarship as well, and to show that this is the sort of material basis and the historical process through which caste subalterns are rendered propertyless, rendered disenfranchised, and then rendered excluded from various processes. And then we come to the aspect of climate crisis or the climate disaster. So these are the examples that I've been talking about, the Yamuna Bank, the Nashik Godavari Front, Shimla. These are all places that have in recent times seen moments of climate disaster that come as moments of crisis in an already crisis-laden setting. So last year, Shimla experienced torrential rainfalls and landslides that led to several deaths and also destruction of precarious housing, informal housing, and rendered significant numbers of people homeless. And we see similar things happening every year with any sort of urban flooding situation. So the climate crisis here, the climate disaster here, comes really at the end of a process, a very long historical process of dispossession, disenfranchisement, and exclusion. And so based on that, I argue that we need to reimagine climate justice in India as caste justice, because otherwise it is entirely possible to have very technocratic solutions, where we come up with apps and such to, fast track the transition from fossil fuels to greener, cleaner forms of energy, or at least to have the appearance of that. And we can continue to, rely on caste-based extractions of labor, caste-based deprivations from resources, and keep that foundation of exclusion and extraction in place while trying to build sort of a greener, cleaner, climate climate resolved, climate adapted, climate resilient, however you want to call it, kind of future. And that would not be justice. That would not be climate justice. And so I'm going to end with that. This is the book that I have been talking about. It's edited by Prakash Kashman, who's one of the speakers later in the series, I think. And the book is also, I know Prakash has gone to great lengths to make the book open access and available for free. So you can go to the Cambridge University Press website and access the book, the entire book, all of the chapters, and download them and read them. And yeah, I hope some of you feel inclined to do that. And I'll just stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Srilata. And I appreciate the plug for this book because I have found, I can't recommend it enough. I found it highly useful. And in fact, it was a good source of knowledge for me as I was putting together this series. So I would recommend it to anybody who wants to dig deeper into these issues. And I really appreciate how you talked about, property ownership as a mode of disenfranchisement and dispossession. And, this is something that just thinking about, connecting what you have said to the kinds of conversations and the discourse in the US, this does get relatively more attention in the US on how this is sort of a property ownership creates a sort of a multi-generational advantage and a disadvantage for low-income communities and people of color. And in fact, the FEMA, which is connecting it to the climate crisis, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the US has found evidence from its own studies that low-income people of color are not only more impacted by climate crisis, but also receive less aid from the government. And a lot of that has to do with the structures of ownerships of property, and which actually is very similar to, Suprakash, what you have covered in your article in New Humanitarian, where structures of compensation when there is disaster or an extreme weather event in India are so different. So there is sort of there's discrimination in relief and aid disbursement, but the compensation is also just structured differently, and that has a lot to do with neighborhoods in which people live and property ownership. So I think it's kind of interesting to read those two articles side by side to see how some of these patterns are actually, global. And even though there are, of course, we should be aware of the nuances and the specifics of the caste system in India. So I'm going to just share those two articles here in the chat. And I want to turn it over to you, Suprakash. I think given the way knowledge is produced in India, I think it would be very helpful for us to get your perspective in what you're seeing and reporting in your journalism. Take it away.
Right. Hello and Jai Bhim. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today on this very, very essential topic. And so before I dive deeper into the topic, I would like to sort of explain how I started to interpret caste when I started my journalism. So whatever literature I had read before my journalistic career, I always thought caste is just a Dalit issue, caste is just an Adivasi issue. But what I realize now, caste is not just a Dalit issue or an Adivasi issue. Caste is like a primary identity of any Indian and to some extent of any South Asian individual. It can either give you either advantage you, and in most cases, it gives you both basically. The intermediate caste communities who are often known as OBCs, the technical term for them. Also Shudras, the historical Vedic term for them. Uh, now, like when we're talking about climate justice, climate change, uh, in my reporting, what I found is like climate change is inherently discriminatory. That means in India, it is casteist because caste is like something like an original sin of our nation, right? It has always existed. Um, so, uh, uh, so like I started reporting in 2022 for this story for the new humanitarian. So like the only two, like how we see like what is disaster, that is a question that is also answered by the oppressor caste communities. For example, I knew like 2018 there was this Kerala flood. In 2019 it was Cyclone Fani in Orissa. Uh, but in like the Kerala flood situation, like why 2018 floods was categorized as a disaster. When I went there and I was talking to a lot of marginalized caste communities, I found like it happened every year. Like Kerala has a problem of perennial floods, but it was never categorized as a disaster. And like in 2018, what happened, like basically water came to the upper caste or dominating caste neighborhoods, and like everyone was okay, so this is disaster. But it's something that these like Dalits, lowered OBCs and Adivasis are going through like for years. So how we are interpreting climate justice, like as Srilata before me said, like climate justice is caste justice. So this is how like on the ground, like people are also interpreting it, although they don't know much about like how climate change is actually affecting them. Like they always knew like, okay, so floods are okay, but now the frequencies have of the floods have increased, but they don't know like why uh, it has happened. Because like with caste comes like where you live, what type of education you will get, or like what is your social status. uh, so there's a study by an organization called NCDHR, National Campaign for Dalit Human Rights. So they published this report in September 2022, which said like climate apartheid is like likely to hit Dalits and the Adivasis the hardest. So Dalits and the Adivasis, so like basically like when the most simplistic diagram we present to explain caste is a pyramid, like where Brahmins are on the top, then there are like four castes, and outside of that pyramid are the Dalits and the Adivasis. And like in anywhere in India, if you see the localities, they are actually following those that diagram, like Brahmins at the top, like the safest part of the town, then like the OBCs on the outskirts, but still inside the town. But Dalits and Adivasis are always outside the town, which is mostly the most vulnerable area, like that for like climate disasters. So they are the first and the worst affected of the effects of climate change. And this is like how how we see climate uh, justice in India. It's again coming from a very upper caste like elitist point of view. Like the government is not releasing any data. I don't even know like if they have any data, like how many Dalits were affected or like affected in any natural disaster. And this brings us to the compensation part. And for example, like in Orissa, like after the Cyclone Feni, there was uh, like uh, like assessment teams were there like to assess like what kind of damage the houses have gone through. And because like the Dalit community, like in a village, like it was a village where like only OBCs and Dalits were there. It wasn't an upper caste village. So when the like officials went to the Dalit houses, they saw, okay, it's just a small hut. Like, okay, so it's a partial damage. They categorize it as a partial damage, and they didn't get the adequate amount of compensation because they couldn't like answer like, okay, why do I need that money? Like the officer just saw, okay, they are just poor, they don't need that money. But for the OBCs, who is which is the dominant uh caste in that village, uh like they like even if it's a minor damage, they somehow got the damage was categorized under like fully damaged, and they got a lot of more than like enough compensation. So like how communities are also interpreting compensation is also very different. Like for the dominant communities, it is something like an opportunity to like, okay, so I'll get this money from the government. For the marginalized communities of the same locality, they see they need that essential compensation, but they don't have hope like they will ever get, because they don't trust, like they have never seen like government or the policies made for them. They don't reach them. So if any of them get like even like a partial amount of the compensation, it's like, okay, it's great. And in the same village, like there's like two types of houses. Like one is like one type is like well built, the others are like covered with blue tarpaulin. And that blue tarpaulin is actually the indicator, okay, these are the Dalits houses, because they never got the compensation. And even the compensation, like how the government is actually, or the policymakers are actually like making policies of compensation, like if like in terms of cattle loss, like if your goat or a sheep was killed, you will get like somewhat around 7 to 8 thousand rupees, which is exactly the amount like the cost of one goat or a sheep. But and if you have lost like hens or smaller cattle, you will get what like a part or like of the cost of the cattle. So and in India, like again, caste determines everything, like what kind of cattle you own. So if you are from a dominant caste, you will get you have bigger cattle such as goats or cows. In lower caste communities, you will have like smaller cattle. So again, like the compensation is not enough, it's not reaching them. There's no feedback mechanism. Like there's no basically they don't have any hope. Like if a climate disaster strikes, like it's a never ending process that begins for the marginalized communities. And so like it brings me to this part, like it's not just we don't always have to just talk about like who are the worst affected. It is important to make communities and the people accountable. Like in Bundelkhand, I was there like last year during the uh, like worst heat wave that India was going through, and it's a semi-arid region, so the water crisis is there, and so there's a popular saying like where roads end, Dalit localities begin, and exactly like for the water connections, like where pipeline ends, the Dalit colonies begin. So, like it is important to make communities, make like the communities or the caste who are controlling the government policy, who are the policy makers, accountable to uh, make climate justice the caste justice, as Srilata said.
You're muted, Dipali.
Oh, sorry. So thank you very much, Suprakash. And I particularly appreciated how you said that something becomes a crisis when the privileged or which is in the case of India, the dominant caste people get impacted. I was actually reading something about, how people think, who are the groups that think of climate crisis as in recent times as existential. It is the privileged who are now seeing this as an existential crisis, whereas I think this is a sort of a continuation, but a more aggravated situation for many. And so and I apologize if I'm saying something very basic, but the IPCC, the United Nations body, says a region is vulnerable to climate change when it has a high number of people who lack the ability or opportunity to cope with climate change related events, whether it's because of poverty, inequality, and lack of institutional support. And I think both of you have actually explained very well why South Asia and India are considered so vulnerable, because the sheer scale of this in India and the number of vulnerable people who struggle and with this ability to cope is very high. So I guess with that we can sort of begin with the conversation part, and also I'll try to integrate the questions that are coming in as well. One of the thoughts that has come here is that reframing climate justice as caste justice is a great idea. And this is something that I also wanted to mention. They're asking if there is any thought of bringing this to the UN. And I just want to note that the UN had actually observed that Dr. Ambedkar had envisioned the UN SDGs 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, almost a century ago. So it's kind of ironical that South Asia and India are so vulnerable despite that vision and the strong tradition of anti-caste movement in India, and somehow that is not connected to environmental movements of the urban and the climate change conversations. So I would ask both of you, what are you seeing? You said that this is an emerging area. So what are you seeing in terms of building? Is there any sort of shift towards allyship and sort of bridging this divide between the sort of the more elitist environmental and climate change movements and these anti-caste struggles, which have a lot to do with environmental rights as well?
So Prakash, do you want to go first?
You can go first, so yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I think I'll maybe like address the UN, like the formal, formalizing the claim in the UN aspect first. I think it's really difficult because there has been, consistent opposition from the Indian state towards getting any kind of official recognition of caste as an issue. So I think in 1994, there was the UN conference on race and racism, where there was, a contingent from India, largely an anti-caste contingent, that was there to, make the claim that caste should be recognized as an aspect of racism. And the Indian government, was very much against it, and it has maintained that caste is an internal issue and a cultural issue, and not comparable to race or racism on the global forum. And I think recently we've seen in the US, that the law in California, which went through in the Senate, I think. I'm sorry, I'm not very proficient with the political terminology of the US, but I think it went through the Senate, but then the governor blocked it, and it later emerged that there was an upper caste donor and influential sort of negotiator who had influenced the governor into blocking the law to recognize, caste discrimination and put it in the law and sort of recognize that as discrimination. So I think it would be difficult to maybe do anything in a formal setting with the UN, because I think the Indian state, especially the current regime, would certainly block such efforts. But coming to what you were talking about, Dipali, in terms of allyship and movement building, I think a lot of it has been happening. It's just that it hasn't been seen as environmental movements. So for example, right now in Ennore, in Chennai, it has been a 30-day long picket, like a very consistent, very persistent picket outside of an ammonia fertilizer plant from where ammonia gas leaks happened. And the people who are participating in this picketing and this political action are from the fishing caste, which is one of the subaltern castes. I'm not entirely sure if they are categorized as Dalit or OBC in the state in that particular area, but they are definitely caste subalterns. And the action that they are taking is certainly a form of environmental activism. It's just not recognized as such. And there are many examples of that where, anti-caste political activism, anti-caste movement building is very much, reliant on asserting rights to the environment, or, rectifying what Malini Ranganathan calls environmental unfreedoms. That is, the inability to, or like, what is referred as environmental racism sometimes in the US context, where a disproportionate amount of the adverse effects of environmental phenomena are borne by racialized, and in the case of India, caste subaltern groups. And these have been issues that the anti-caste movement has been dealing with and taking up on a consistent basis. It's just that the mainstream of the environmental movement in India hasn't recognized that. And I think that is starting to happen. I think with newer activists, younger activists coming into the fold, and with more representation of subaltern caste groups within the mainstream environmental movement, I think it is starting to happen. And I think we've probably reached that inflection point where it's no longer possible to ignore the issue of caste. It's just so, facing us so clearly, so starkly in the face that it's almost impossible. But I think Suprakash might have a closer understanding of what's happening on the ground, from his reporting experience.
Yeah, so like I or maybe any anti-caste person believes in representation, like for example, this compensation and the officers who are like government officials who are going and assessing the damage, like they are coming from most probably like upper caste backgrounds. So like if any individual from say marginalized communities enter into these policy making positions, like it's not just for that one person getting a salaried secure job. It's also like that person is bringing the expertise, experiences of the entire community. For example, me being a Dalit and a journalist, uh, journalism being a very, very upper caste centric space in India, it's almost impossible for a Dalit to enter in mainstream media. Uh, when a person like me and many others like me are coming in, we are bringing expertise and our experiences with us, right? So that's why it's important to uh, acknowledge and give representation to people like more activists, more intellectuals, more scholars into this field. Like there are like certain pressure groups, for example, I mentioned NCDHR for like they have being trying to bring this issue to the UN also. But again, the problem is the government and the Indian society. The India's NAPCC does not acknowledge caste at all. Like although they are taking funds from the exclusive funds that are meant for scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, but there are no specific policies which are addressing the issues of the SCs and STs, because there are no policymakers who are coming from the marginalized communities.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I also wanted to, you talked about, the way smart cities, and I know that's the same thing with this Swachh Bharat. There are these big programs, and they seem to, uh, have the language of development. But the way you both have described it is that they are actually, there's a lot of social exclusion and further marginalization built into this. So where do you think, I guess in terms of hope and progress, where do you think we can, the people in our audience and our, future policymakers and decision makers and knowledge producers move the needle? Is it more in planning processes? Is it more in implementation? Where are the current breakdowns happening, and where do you think the interventions will be most useful?
I think for me, it is definitely the people on the street, the people that are mobilizing. I think the only thing that seems to be able to really shape and bring about progressive change in policymaking and planning, at least like as far as the urban setting is concerned. And I mean, I think also with like the farmers movement and the 3-farm bills that eventually were withdrawn, also in the agrarian setting, the only thing that seems to work is people coming out on the streets and mobilizing and protesting and demanding their rights and putting forward their claims and asserting their rights. So I think that is where the needle of hope points us to, and that is what we should also be very, very careful to protect, those rights to be able to continue to do those things, because the space for that is shrinking, and there is a lot of, it's not easy to be an activist and to be out on the streets protesting, especially as far as the urban setting is concerned, it is literally people putting their bodies, on the ground, like it's the bulldozer versus the body, literally, in most circumstances. But I think that is really where the hope lies, because of course there can be changes at the judicial level and at the policy level, but all of that is sort of incremental, and it comes through a very long drawn process, because you first need like Suprakash said, greater representation, which in itself takes a long time. And then you need, those who are there as representatives to also then align politically with a certain, disposition to, have the same kind of progressive ideals, which again, it's a long drawn process. It's in terms of like getting immediate sort of results, I think the hope lies in the people on the street, for me at least. I don't know what Suprakash would say.
Yeah, so for me, it's like how we see and interpret the struggles of the marginalized communities. Like, it's not like, I personally don't see like it just as a Dalit issue or another Adivasi issue. Like, for me, like it's because they are not just a small population of the country, right? So if the like the fight for climate justice in India at least is failing these communities, I think, like, for example, the national climate policy, mitigation policies, I think those policies are failing the entire nation. It's not working at all because they are the first and the worst victims of those consequences of climate justice. So it's how we see these communities also, like when we are also talking about like how climate change is affecting Dalits. So personally, I also feel like it's alienating the community also. It is important to talk about them, but it has to be something like, again, the accountability. Like, why are they not getting the adequate response from the other communities and the policymakers and the government? So, yeah.
Actually, you talked about policies failing, and I think one aspect of the impacted communities also that gets overlooked is that there is a lot of knowledge, right, within these communities that can actually help if that knowledge is incorporated into the policies. And if so, Prakash, I read your article on waste energy connection and how the solutions, by not incorporating the knowledge of the traditional Dalit garbage pickers, are actually at risk of failing. So what would be both of you, your sort of just advice on how these sort of, top-down interventions can actually partner with, and I guess some of it is just, I think, lack of awareness, frankly. But, as things begin to shift And this becomes, as you said, Suprakash, that this is actually not a crisis for just marginalized communities. It is actually a national crisis and a global crisis. So how would you, sort of suggest that these top-down large programs partner up with communities that are not just impacted, but actually have a lot of knowledge to help solve these problems?
Right. So it's basically reaching to the communities. For example, I have this instance when I was reporting a humanitarian story. I was in Kerala, and so I went to this Dalit Christian neighborhood. Right. So there was this very old woman who came to me. She got to know like I'm a journalist, and she like sort of very amazed, like she has never seen a journalist there. And I was actually asking her questions about like her experiences during the floods of 2019, and like what she said, like when she was in the relief camp, she saw a lot of these journalists going to only specific looking, the upper caste looking folks, and asking them, right? They have never gone to these marginalized communities, neighborhoods. So the point is like we need a feedback mechanism. Like we need, like for example, journalism, like it has to be, again, it comes down to representation. Like this adequate representation is important, because if we don't know like what is happening, like you can't have a solution for that. And this ignorance is exactly what I sort of wrote in the why story you are talking about, the waste to energy story, because they don't talk to them. They think they are illiterate. Like there's a specific image of a ideal Dalit, a poor, look like poor person, skinny person, malnourished, but it's not always the case, right? Because we have traditional knowledge of the caste occupations, like which were forced on us, maybe, but they are important also.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think needs to happen very urgently in the planning process and policymaking process is a reorientation of priorities. So let's say you mentioned, Dipali, the Swachh Bharat mission. So what is the priority here, in the mission? Or, what is the stated sort of goal and objective? The objective, purportedly is to have pakka toilets, or, like to end open defecation and to have toilets that flush and sort of treat human waste in a presentable fashion that has markers of like modernity and progress and all of that. Now, if we rethink the priority and the goal of this as the problem not being that there is open defecation practices, but the problem is that we have a very large workforce working under extremely undignified labor conditions because of this practice of manual scavenging, which is outlawed but continues to exist and is deployed by state agencies on the regular basis. So if we see that as the problem that needs to be fixed, and the goal as, okay, we need to bring dignity to sanitation work, and through that then think about, so what do we need to do to reach that goal? You might have the same kind of interventions in the sense that, okay, yeah, we need to build mechanized toilets, etc. But then you would also be thinking about, okay, so if we build these toilets, like who is then taking care of them? Who is still doing the labor of actually cleaning the toilet pit? And that is when you will realize, as a policymaker, that actually you cannot just stop at building toilets that make the human waste sort of just disappear out of sight, and then we leave it to the same sanitation workers to continue to work in the same undignified conditions to clean those toilets that have only the part of the technology that makes it look sanitized, but not the part of the technology that actually brings dignity to labor. So if we shift the priorities, and this is what I mean by reimagining climate justice as caste justice, or to reimagine progress, development, planning, whatever it is, as caste justice. So I think we need to reorient the priorities about, what is the end goal that we are aspiring to? Is it just to look a certain way, or is it to actually bring dignity and rehabilitation, and to have dignity of labor, and to have an equal society at the end of the day? And I think speaking of that, there's also a question about the preamble, I think, in the chat. I just want to very quickly say that it's not an interpretation. It's actually there in the text of the preamble. It very clearly says that we solemnly resolve to, bring to each other justice, social, social, etc., and then equality of status and opportunity. So the term equality of status and opportunity is something there in the preamble very clearly. And it is one of the things that the people of India are supposed to be giving to themselves through the constitution. So it is very much enshrined in constitutional morality, so to say.
Yeah, and thank you for that, both of you. And as I had mentioned at the beginning, today is actually a really good day we should be mindful of this every day, but today is a particularly good day to think about that, being Republic Day in India. And there, you can, for anybody who's interested, the Constituent Assembly debates are, publicly available. I think, that's a great source of information on how, India got this rights-based constitution, and no matter how far away the country might be from realizing, it is an aspiration. And also there's a book, Ambedkar's Preamble, A Secret History of the Constitution of India, that actually specifically gets into how much the preamble of the Constitution actually comes from his speeches and his writings before the Constitution, the drafting of the Constitution began. So how much of it the preamble has the stamp of Dr. Ambedkar on it. I'm just looking to see if we have any other questions. I also wanted to mention that, I think we mentioned at the beginning that this is a very emerging area, and that caste is a very overlooked topic in climate conversations. So I have a feeling that our audience is also just processing this, and this is as much about awareness building and taking us in, I think, what would be unfamiliar and uncomfortable places for many. So I just want to encourage the audience that if people who have questions, and if you're holding back, I think there is no such thing as a bad question. The very nature of these discussions is for us to begin to think about things that have been, unfortunately marginalized. And as has been noted by our speakers, we are at an inflection point, and this is everybody's crisis. So, we would welcome more questions. And then I wanted to also ask you both, there is this climate mitigation, but there's also this aspect of resilience building and adaptation. And I feel like, that's more bottom up. And that's where I feel like there's hope, because, we learn about these drought resistant farming practices led by marginalized women. Or I was just reading a report on jobs in decentralized renewable energy, which are coming up in rural India. So at a time when there isn't actually jobs crisis. So that's kind of feels like, a piece of good news. So yeah, just your thoughts on, resilience and adaptation, and how do you see that? And if you also is like you said, there are the protests, and then is that kind of, things that are happening, probably not getting as much reporting because we don't have as many journalists like Suprakash, but is there, hope and optimism there?
Yeah. So this adaptation, the climate adaptation, yes, there is hope. I won't be a person who is hopeless. But it's because there's a lot of because of social media. So a lot of anti-caste activists on ground are actually getting voices. So maybe there are not many Dalit journalists. There are many Dalit Adivasi content creators who are not just making entertainment content, but also showing their own problems, lives, and other community members. So, this is something like a network is forming, and people are exchanging ideas within the communities, and these ideas are also reaching, to spaces like this. where we are actually discussing these topics, which are like sort of uncomfortable for a lot of upper caste folks out there in India. So yes, I think this climate adaptation, it is not as great as it should be, or workable. Like for example, the Bundelkhand drought crisis. So at least there is a conversation now. Like there are some reporters who are actually talking about it, and there's some accountability also, because a lot of international aid organizations are also funding in these areas for climate adaptation. So yeah, again, the information is key. Like this hidden sort of information from the powerful class is actually getting the light now.
Yeah, I think, of course, adaptation and building resilience are the sort of dominant paradigms for, I guess, managing and navigating the climate crisis. And I think it is so far entrenched now that it's difficult to extract yourself from that and think about an alternative paradigm. And I think it comes with like pros and cons, for the lack of better terminology, because I feel like often the push to adapt and the push to build resilience is a sort of added burden that is placed on communities that are already vulnerable. So, for example, it's like, oh, let's say, talking about mangrove forests, like in the Sundarban area, the approach of the policy structure or the aid structure is sort of like, oh, your freshwater is now brackish. Why don't you just change the kind of fishing you do? Or, okay, your salt has been salinated because of brackish water intrusion. Why don't you just change the kind of rice that you grow? Or why don't you just switch from rice cultivation to fish cultivation? Oh, fish cultivation is causing further, environmental damage. Why don't you just switch to like an export-oriented um, market rather than? So it's like there is adaptation, and these are adaptations that do keep communities alive, in the sense of keeping livelihood opportunities alive. But it is also an added burden on the communities to keep adapting and keep building resilience when we do not place those kinds of burdens on the caste elite, on the urban elite, on the policy makers, so to say. We continue to use our air conditioning and do enjoy all of the kind of the lifestyle that comes with this very strong, heavy climate burden attached to it. And so the burden of adaptation and resilience is often placed on the same communities who are already vulnerable to the impacts. And I think that is something, again, we have to like reorient the priorities in the adaptation and resilience complex and think about how can we prioritize reducing vulnerabilities, addressing historical injustices, and through that, rethinking what adaptation and resilience can look like.
Thank you for that great insight. We have only maybe a minute or so left for both of you, and then I would need to close this out. So I just wanted to ask you if you have any final thoughts, or if there are any questions that you're seeing that you'd like to answer before we close this out.
I see a question about future collaborations between social justice activists in America and India specifically. I think there already are. There are coalitions, and I think India has quite an active sort of climate justice movement that is also very keyed into, and that is very intersectional, that's very keyed into also like issues of caste and gender and other forms of exclusion. And I think it's also a movement that's very keyed into the global dialogue on environmental justice. Even if it's a small number of people, it is still there, and it's growing, especially young activists, I think, from schools and colleges, who are now starting to sort of get more visibility and take up more space in the public domain and set the agenda through those intersectional lenses. So I think those alliances are, they're present and they're very much developing. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
So Prakash, any final thoughts?
Well, like the final thoughts are like it's really important, like we acknowledge the vulnerable communities in India. Like we need to see like who are the most vulnerable communities, and we need to have this feedback mechanism. We need to hear the voices and don't treat them like some different community. It's a part of this country, like, and they need like representation to like make the climate policies of India better. And at a like global level, it's also important, like a country like India like should like set a precedent, like how an ideal climate justice or environmental justice movement should look like.
Okay, on this inspiring note, I'm going to close out this event. I want to especially thank you both again, Srilata and Suprakash, for your important work and brilliant insights. And Suprakash, you joined us very late, at a very late hour in India. So a big thank you for that. Anupama thanked our sponsors and organizers. So I'm just going to end with a reminder that our next in this climate justice series is on the topic of segregation and environmental injustice. That's on February 9th, 10 to 11:30 US Eastern Time, and a full recording of this session and a full calendar of upcoming events can be found on the Center on Global Energy Policy website. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day or your evening, depending on where you are, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.